Charles, Royal Palace of Madrid, November the 1st, 1700. The king is dead, but his blood is missing. They found him at dawn cold, collapsed in a velvet chair, his mouth gaped open, swollen tongue hanging like a dead leech. His skin had turned the color of wax left too close to a flame, beneath the sheets. His legs were rigid, bloated, leaking something black. The chamber stank, a sour mix of old meat, urine, and rotting breath. Servants crossed themselves and whispered prayers they hadn't said in years. Some vomited, one ran. When they slit him open, the surgeons froze. No blood, none. Just a shriveled heart the size of a plum. A single blackened testicle. An intestine so decayed they slipped apart like wet paper. His skull cracked like thin porcelain, and the brain inside spilled out like soup. The body was wrong, unnatural, as if it had kept something hidden far too long. Behind closed doors, the whispers began. He had been cursed, they said, poisoned, replaced. His wives had seen things. His priests had burned things. And under his bed, someone found a dead bird sewn shut with human hair. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. But this was no fairy tale. This was the final breath of an empire collapsing from the inside, rotting, bone by bone, from a bloodline that fed on itself. And the real horror. He lived like this for 38 years. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to be spoken aloud. Madrid, midnight whispers. The infant sleeps or seems to, but his breathing strains like wind through rusted iron. The nurses shift, linen rustling, and the candlelight trembles against cold stone walls. A hush falls when the doctor leans close, forehead dripping with sweat, fingers probe the skull, nails tracing the suture lines that never closed, a soft cracking, a skull full of water. By dawn, he is a watcher in a pale cradle, mouth agape, jaw grotesque, the lower lip protruding over an upper lip that seems too small, like clay forced from a mold. Languid drool trickles in slow rivulets, pooling on embroidered silk. Straw beneath the cradle captures that fullness sticky, a stench rising sour milk, stale sweat, and something fetid from inside him. The queen moves around his crib like a ghost. She is mother, niece, cousin. She places a hand near his cheek but draws it back. As if scorched, her eyes are hollow, heavy with dread, as though she senses the secrets that ripple through this child's veins. In the sunlight, the court gathers, murmurs swirl, a royal birth, they say, a miracle. But behind those smiles, the courtiers avoid stares. They sense something hidden, a DNA wound that loops in on itself. Each glance toward him trembles with expectation and fear. At age 4, Charles remains fragile. His coat hangs loose on thin shoulders. He cannot walk. He slides in his father's arms like a broken rag. His breathing rattles each time he shifts position, and he gasps as if waking from some shared nightmare. One morning, the nurse places a spoon to his lips, puree of pounded meat, wine-soaked bread. He opens a mouth that trembles, jaw locked in a fixed arc, and swallows with the effort of drowning. He coughs. The spit spray glints in candlelight. The nurse wipes his lips, face drawn tight. He babbles once in months. A word warps in his throat, tongue swollen, cramped. The syllables die before they reach her ears. At the table, he stares past mother and courtiers, gaze empty as a blind man's, following shapes no one else can see. In bed, he twists restlessly. Sheets cling to fevered skin. Night sweats soak white linen. A pulse pounds in his temple. Pain blooms behind closed eyelids like twin suns. The wet warmth of the chamber clots in the air. He moans, a brittle echo that catches in the throat of a serving boy nearby. All around him, the court feels the weight of ritual. Baptisms, proclamations, portraits, but they hang him upside down in a painting cherubic face and solemn eyes. A crown too heavy for that empty head. They smile in gold gilding, but they do not acknowledge the tremor in his jaw, the drool at the corner of his mouth, the way he leans into shadows in every portrait. Through the glass windows, sunlight catches dust motes, drifting over silent servants. In the corridors, Page boys pause, sliding their footsteps as though walking on ice. They feel his breath in the wall cracks. They hear the faint hiss of his lungs. The queen retreats to her chambers, draping curtains shut. Candle smoke curls in the air. She loosens a ribbon in her hair. Beneath calm features, her lips quiver. She speaks to no one. In her hand, she holds a miniature portrait, his father and grandfather. Faces identical, carved from the same bone. Her thumb traces the curve of his chin. She hears the whisper, "They have fed you your own undoing." Each morning, he is carried in a velvet chair through the palace halls. Courtiers bow. The child's hand lies limp in his nurse's palm. He cannot lift an arm. Cloth rustles. Jewels tinkle. No one approaches. A hush. Even the court breeze avoids him, as if he carries a rot no one can name. At 4, he still cannot speak, cannot stand. Words die on his lips like moth wings brushing glass. When visitors offer toys, wooden horses, painted balls, he holds them until his fingers ache, then drops them. Broken toys litter the floor. No laughter echoes. He is cradled by silence. He is cradled by dread. And behind every exalted prayer for health and future reign, there is a murmured question: how long until the bones give way? How long until the line cracks? The infant in the cradle is meant to carry a throne, but his body is governed by decay. The blood in his veins is not just inheritance, it is collapse. And as each courtier glances away, they fear what comes next. But the real betrayal hadn't happened yet. The family did not branch, it folded in on itself. The Habsburgs didn't marry for love. They didn't even marry for power. They married for blood, thick, concentrated, unchanging. It was their obsession, their altar, and Charles was the final offering. In the halls of El Escorial, the portraits whisper, generations locked in identical stares, downturned mouths, jutted jaws, the same hollow stare of an animal bred too long in a cage. The air between those frames hangs thick. Dust never quite settles. It clings like the memory of breath. His father, Philip IV, had married his own niece, not once, but by design. His father before him had done the same. Brothers married nieces, cousins married cousins. The same pair of ancestors, Philip the Handsome and Joanna the Mad, appear again and again. Like ghosts that never leave the room, 8 great-grandparents, all one couple. The priests called it divine symmetry. The physicians knew better. But no one spoke against it, not in the royal court, not in the candlelit bedchambers where deals were made in whispers and signed with rings, not ink. At night, the Queen Mother Mariana paced her halls with a candle. She knew she had grown up among the same silences, watched aunts become sisters-in-law, watched brothers become husbands, watched coffins stacked before a child's 10th birthday. She carried that weight in her face, sharp, pale, drained, and now she carried it in her son. She stared at him during the Mass. He sat slumped, legs dangling, eyes drifting above the altar. The incense swirled. A drop of wax fell from the candle near his cheek. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. And Mariana, for the first time in public, wept. In the libraries, behind locked cabinets, the scribes had begun to document the line. Pages of marriages charted in tight, curling script, names repeated, the ink looped. Whole pages began to resemble wheels, not trees. The court mathematician said nothing aloud, but one night, he packed a satchel and vanished. By age 6, Charles's condition drew fewer questions and more nods of acceptance. He drooled openly during audiences. A servant stood behind him with a cloth. He could not walk unaided, but the court adjusted their pace. He could not hold a scepter. So, they shortened the one they gave him. They didn't fix the boy. They bent the kingdom around him. One advisor, late to court, once found Charles on the floor, face pressed to the tiles, arms limp, moaning softly. No one moved, no one helped. They stood in quiet formation, eyes forward, like a congregation pretending the statue still smiles. In the garden, a nobleman's daughter saw him from a balcony. She described him later, in a letter. The prince does not walk. He is pushed. As one pushes a puppet in a chair, his mouth hangs open like a broken mask. His gaze is not with us. He is not with us. And still, he was their future. In the palace kitchens, they boiled food soft as clay. Meats were pounded, vegetables were reduced to paste, bread soaked in wine until it dissolved. The plates were silver, but the meals were for an infant, always. His tongue thick, twitching fought every swallow. He'd gag, he'd choke, and still they fed him. Because he had to live, he had to survive. The family line could not end, even if it no longer walked, or spoke, or knew its own name. One evening, a cardinal leaned close to the Queen Mother. His voice was low. "It is not illness," he said. "It is the mirror. We are only seeing ourselves." She did not respond. In the vaults beneath the monastery, old bones rested kings, queens, princes who had died before reaching the age of speech. The child mortality rate in the dynasty was no mystery to those who cleaned those coffins. They saw the little jaws, the bent femurs, the misshapen skulls that no longer needed to be hidden behind lace. But Charles lived, somehow, like a house with broken beams that still stands in the wind, because the wind had nowhere else to go. And still, no one spoke against it. Not when Charles sat through Mass and mumbled nonsense Latin. Not when his tutors reported he could not remember the alphabet. Not when he mistook his own reflection for a stranger, night after night. Because the family was holy, the blood was sacred, the collapse was destiny. And so they praised him, touched his hand, called him strong, spoke of his wisdom, prayed for his seed. But deep beneath the marble floors, something ancient was creaking. The walls of inheritance had grown soft. The bones of empires were bending. And still, no one could explain the scratches on her neck. In the long corridors of the Alcazar, his footsteps never echoed, because he never walked them. By the age of 10, Charles still had to be carried first in a padded velvet sling, then in a carved wooden chair with wheels that creaked against the stone. Each morning, 2 servants would lift him from his bed, where he lay curled like a child, far younger. His limbs were thin, as if drained of marrow, his spine arched too easily, his head massive, pale. Swollen seemed to lead his body like an anchor. They dressed him in layers of silk and brocade, embroidered with the golden lions of Castile. They painted rouge onto his cheeks to simulate vitality, but the face in the mirror was gray beneath the powder, lips dry, eyes drifting. He never asked questions. He barely reacted. Tutors would kneel beside him, speaking of kingship in Latin verbs, only to watch his gaze wander to a window, to the ceiling, to a flickering candle. Once, he giggled at the way light made shadows move on a tapestry, then silence, then drool. At court gatherings, he was placed at the head of the table. The plates before him were ceremonial. He could not cut meat. He could not hold a goblet. A servant at his side guided spoon to mouth, cloth to chin, hand to napkin, always silent, always mechanical. When he did speak, the words came warped, tangled in the thick mass of tongue and jaw. His voice was high and wet, like air escaping from damp cloth. Few understood him. Most nodded and smiled, as if comprehension was a form of loyalty. They didn't speak of his jaw, but everyone saw it. The infamous Habsburg chin, elongated, protruding, had reached its cruel climax in him. It deformed the symmetry of his face, forced his teeth apart so no two could touch. His mouth never closed fully. It hung, eternally open, like a wound that would not scab. Food slipped from his lips, spit gathered in the corners. At night, he would cough in his sleep, half choked by his own saliva. His nurses took shifts. One held his head upright, another wiped him clean, a third prayed. They called it care, but in truth, it was containment. In winter, the palace turned to stone, fires hissed in the hearths, but Charles felt no warmth. His fingers were cold to the touch, skin waxy and thin. He complained of headaches, of pressure behind the eyes. Once, during Mass, he screamed without warning hands to his skull, eyes wide with panic as if something inside had burst. After that, the physicians came more often. They tapped his skull, drained fluid, applied leeches behind the ears. They whispered of pressure, swelling, imbalance, but they never said the word hydrocephalus. They only recorded the measurements head circumference, days of lucidity, quantity of fluid extracted. And the priests followed, with relics, with bone dust, with candle smoke and iron crosses. They muttered Latin incantations and touched his temples with holy oils. Sometimes Charles cried, not out of fear, but because his skin was too tender, and the oil burned. He was not a prince now. He was a vessel, a symbol, a test. His mother watched all of this from behind a fan. Mariana no longer asked questions. She no longer wept in public. She sat like marble, lips pressed tight, hands folded so tightly her knuckles turned white. Only once did her mask crack when Charles laughed. Inexplicably. While the doctor described his failing liver, she slapped the tray from his lap and then wept in silence, long after everyone else had gone. Outside, Spain was changing. Crops failed, silver from the Americas arrived late, famine crept into the villages. In the cathedrals, people prayed for strength and for a king who might one day speak to them. But inside the palace, the boy grew older without growing up. By 12, he still could not read. He could not sign his own name. He did not understand numbers. He mistook the seasons. He asked the same questions every week. And yet they crowned him regent. Trumpets blared, flags waved, and Charles, draped in robes too large, sat slumped on a golden throne. He blinked against the torchlight. He smiled at nothing. The people applauded. They had no choice. Behind him, Mariana clenched her hands. Because no one believed he could rule, but no one dared ask who really did. And in the shadows of the throne room, a rat crawled over spilled wax. The child king blinked, then smiled again. But the real disfigurement hadn't surfaced yet. The wedding bells rang through Madrid like a funeral hymn wrapped in gold. She arrived in spring Marie-Louise of Orleans, barely 17, pale-skinned, dark-eyed, cheeks flushed with the weight of hope and obligation. She had been promised to a king, but what stepped forward to greet her was a figure swaying beneath ceremonial robes, mouth open, hands trembling. He smiled, slack-jawed. His lips were wet, his eyes drifted, unfocused, then locked on her corset as if trying to understand how it worked. The crowd clapped, trumpets soared, but behind her veil, Marie-Louise's breath quickened. The wedding night was silent. He could not undress himself, could not lift the goblet to his lips. His servants withdrew, leaving her alone in the candlelit dark, the scent of musk and wax and stale breath. Charles sat on the edge of the bed, murmuring to the floor. Then, with effort, he lay back and began to cry. Weeks passed, then months. The court began to whisper. Marie-Louise smiled for portraits, dined in public, rode horses when weather permitted, but behind the painted shutters of her rooms, she aged. The sparkle of girlhood dulled. Her hands trembled when servants combed her hair. Her letters home became shorter. She had been trained for diplomacy, not despair, but her nights were filled with strange remedies. One court physician gave Charles powdered pearls and wine. Another had him swallow bits of deer's genitals, soaked in vinegar. Holy men gave them relics to place under the pillow. Midwives burned herbs beneath the bed. One apothecary claimed a black goat's testicle placed beneath the tongue could stir a king's seed. He tried it. He vomited. Marie-Louise never complained. She never accused. But the silence in her eyes was louder than any scream. Once, during supper, he reached for her hand. His fingers trembled. His nails were soft. She watched him struggle, then gently offered hers. He held it too tightly, as if it might anchor him to the world. He could not perform. The court called it impotence, but it was more than that. His body did not function as a man's should. His testicles were misshapen, his bones brittle, his desire childlike and confused. When he kissed her neck, he wept. When she tried to hold him, he flinched. Years passed. No hair. The queen fell ill headaches, fainting spells. Some said it was grief, others said poison. Her appetite vanished, her waist thinned. She wandered the gardens alone, whispering prayers to statues. Then one autumn morning, she did not rise. The chambermaids found her cold, face serene, hands folded neatly, a vial beside her bed, empty. The court erupted. Some claimed she had been murdered by a rival faction, by jealous courtiers, by the Queen Mother herself. Others whispered suicide, but no one dared speak above a whisper. Charles was inconsolable. He tore at his clothes. He wandered the halls for days, barefoot, muttering her name. He kissed her corpse. He refused burial for 3 days. Her body lay in state while the stench of decay began to rise. Only then did they take her away. He followed the coffin through the chapel, eyes swollen, mouth agape. He collapsed at the altar. They thought he might die, then and there. But he didn't. He married again. Maria Anna of Neuburg, chosen for her lineage of fertility, 11 siblings, a family of breeders. The court had hope again. But Charles was worse. His hair had begun to fall in clumps. His teeth loosened. He suffered seizures at night. He saw visions. He heard voices. He claimed to see ghosts in mirrors, devils in doorways. His new queen watched all of it in stunned silence. She bathed with him in sanctified water. She lay with him on holy relics. She drank brews of powdered amber, pigeon's blood, and blessed salt. She let priests place iron rings on her abdomen while she slept, but nothing came. No child, no pregnancy, no change. She grew distant, hardened. Her eyes no longer lingered when he spoke. She took long walks alone. She avoided the royal bed. The king, meanwhile, decayed. His gait slowed. His words slurred. He soiled himself. His hands shook so violently he could no longer sign his name. At night, he screamed for Marie-Louise. At dawn, he sat motionless in his chair, staring at nothing, a line of drool shining down his chin. And in the palace corridors, the candles burned lower. The nobility began to drift, some to France, others to Austria. The court grew quieter, the air hung heavy, and no one dared speak aloud what they all knew. There would be no heir. And still, they kept feeding him. But the real unraveling hadn't yet begun. By 30, Charles had the body of a man twice his age and the spirit of someone already gone. His skin sagged like melting wax, his cheeks hollowed beneath eyes sunken in perpetual shadow. His walk, if it could still be called, that was a shuffle. Knees bent inward, spine hunched, as if the weight of the crown had begun fusing with his skull. Some mornings, he forgot how to stand. He would wake in soaked linens, lips cracked, eyes crusted shut. The servants would gather like mourners lifting, cleaning, dressing him as if preparing a corpse for burial. They whispered to each other in Latin, not prayers, curses, perhaps pleas. His fingers twisted into claws, his nails turned soft and discolored, his gums bled. He could no longer chew. His meals were strained into liquid. Wine gave him nosebleeds. Water made him cough. They tried to hide the smell. Camphor, rosemary, orange blossom, nothing worked. The stench of infection deep, sour, and damp clung to him like a second skin. When he entered a room, courtiers turned subtly away. They bowed with smiles, but their eyes flinched. And still they called him Majesty. He began to forget names, faces, then years. Once, during a state ceremony, he turned to the bishop beside him and asked what the occasion was. It was his own birthday. He wept when they told him, then laughed, then stared into space for the remainder of the service. The queen no longer touched him. Maria Anna had become a statue at his side, present, unmoved, untouched. She whispered to her ladies in German. She wrote long letters to her brothers. At night, she locked her doors, sometimes. From behind them, soft weeping could be heard, sometimes. Silence so deep it felt like drowning. Charles began to speak of curses. He claimed someone had hexed him, that his blood was being drained at night, that shadows watched him from the foot of his bed. He said his bones whispered, that he saw children standing at the end of corridors, even when none were there. The court called the priests. Exorcists arrived from Toledo and Rome. They brought relics and scrolls, salt and ash. They lit incense until the palace choked with it. They questioned the servants. They blessed the food. They searched for hidden amulets and cursed dolls. They found none. One night, they placed a saint's bone under Charles's pillow. By morning, it was cracked. They whispered it was the devil. They stripped the palace of mirrors, burned the mattresses, boiled the linens. Still, Charles screamed in his sleep. Still, he saw faces no one else could see. His seizures grew more violent, his joints locked, his eyes rolled back into his skull. Afterward, he would lie motionless for hours, staring upward, lips moving but no sound escaping. The Queen stopped entering his room alone. The physicians grew desperate. They lanced boils, drew blood until he fainted, applied leeches to his temples, injected him with concoctions of gold, opium, and human fat. Nothing worked. His muscles wasted. His teeth turned black. His hair came out in clumps, littering the silk pillow like autumn leaves. Once, he coughed something up. It was dark and stringy. The physician held it in a cloth, then burned it without explanation. By now, the boy who could not walk was a man who could not rise. He was no longer king in anything but name. Orders came from elsewhere, from the Queen, from foreign advisors, from the void that hovered above his bed. But still, they made him sign decrees. They guided his hand. They inked the pen for him. They held his wrist as he scrawled a crooked C across documents that shaped the future of a continent. Because a king must rule even when his body is rotting, even when his mind is unraveling like wet thread. In one of his final public appearances, he stood beneath the great tapestries of the Escorial, arms at his sides, mouth slightly open. A photographer had arrived. The court adjusted his robes, combed what was left of his hair, powdered his cheeks. He blinked into the light, then vomited. The image was never printed. Rumors began to stir. They said he had died already, that a body double now sat the throne, that the real Charles had been hidden locked in a tower, or buried under the palace, or taken by the devil himself. They said the Queen had poisoned him, or the French, or his own blood, twisted into a noose by generations of incest. They said the line had ended, and that Spain would fall with him. But Charles kept breathing, against all odds, against the very logic of medicine, time, and flesh. Each breath came ragged, wet, and slow. And still, no one dared touch the crown. He no longer resembled a man. By autumn of 1700, Charles had become something else, something caught between breath and silence. His cheeks had hollowed into sharp creases, as if the flesh had given up clinging to bone. His skin had taken on a yellow hue, stretched thin over a body that felt more bone than blood. He could not rise from bed. He could barely lift his head. His breath rasped like parchment being torn slowly, again and again, and still they dressed him in royal silk. He no longer spoke. Words had abandoned him, replaced by faint groans, a wet cough, the occasional mumble that even his priests could not decipher. But when the bishop placed a crucifix to his lips, he tried to kiss it. That, they said, meant he still knew God. In the shadowed corners of the royal chamber, the air thickened with oil, smoke, and something else decay. The velvet curtains stayed drawn, not for light, but for shame. Flies gathered near the basin. A damp cloth sat permanently on his forehead, beneath the sheets. His legs had stiffened. The swelling had returned, and with it, the smell. They called for holy relics. They laid the bones of saints across his chest. They brought hair from the Virgin, wrapped in glass. They made him sleep on wax masks of martyrs. One friar placed a candle made from human fat at the foot of his bed and whispered prayers in the old tongue, prayers not found in any book. They buried knives in the garden to confuse spirits, hung garlic from the windows, burned the linens, and buried the ashes beneath the chapel steps. Nothing stopped the coughing. Nothing cooled the fever. The Queen stayed away. She entered only with gloves, a cloth pressed to her nose. She bowed, kissed his hand, spoke softly in her German accent, but her eyes never met his. She had already begun packing. By October, Charles had stopped eating. His tongue was too swollen. His jaw refused to close. What little they poured into his mouth, he vomited back. His belly bloated, hard as stone. His liver had failed, his vision clouded. But he clung to life. He whispered things no one understood, names that hadn't been spoken in decades. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he screamed, once, in the middle of the night. He rose without help and stood barefoot by the fireplace, staring into the flames. His nurse found him shaking, whispering, "The room is full." He collapsed moments later. The court began drafting succession plans. Letters flew to Vienna, to Paris, to Rome. The question was no longer if he would die, but who would rise from the ashes. Troops began shifting along borders. Nobles held quiet meetings in candlelit halls. Each waited for the final breath. And then November 1st, All Saints' Day. The bells rang low, not yet for him, but the court knew. He had not moved in 3 days. His fingers were cold. His breath had turned to a soft wheeze. They pressed their ears to his chest, faint, unsteady, but still there. Until it wasn't. At 3:45 in the morning, Charles II of Spain died. They did not cheer. They did not cry. They simply exhaled. The autopsy was immediate. The surgeons worked in silence, the doors sealed. Only a few were permitted to witness. What they found would not be written in any official record. His heart was the size of a dried fig. His lungs were blackened and stiff, his intestines rotting, his stomach bloated with fluid. His brain swam in its own liquid, twice the normal volume. His liver had shriveled, his spine was warped, and his genitals, one missing entirely, the other shriveled, dark, unrecognizable. There was no blood, not a drop. One physician dropped his scalpel and left the room. Another sat down and began to pray, not for the soul of the dead, but for those still living. They sealed the body with wax and perfumes, dressed it in gold and lace. But the rot had already begun. His coffin was closed within hours. The courtiers filed in for one last look. But no one stayed long. Outside, the streets were quiet, no procession, no outpouring. The city had been grieving long before his death. What was left to mourn? Inside the palace, they began removing his portraits, packing the heirlooms, scrubbing the bed. The last Habsburg was gone. And yet, the room remained warm, too warm, the air heavy, thick. A servant, clearing the linens, claimed she heard breathing. But the real silence was the silence of lineage. There would be no child, no next king, only war. And still, no one could forget the smell. They buried him beneath the marble of El Escorial, deep in the royal crypt, beside kings who had once commanded continents, a golden nameplate, a velvet-lined casket, and inside, bones too soft to last the century. The chapel was cold. The priest said the rites. The incense drifted, but no one cried, not even the queen. She sat in silence, black veil drawn, lips unmoving, her eyes fixed on the floor on the shadow beneath the coffin. She did not follow it as it passed. She simply whispered, "It's done." But it wasn't. The succession war began before the last candle burned out. Letters sealed in wax were opened by trembling hands. Bloodlines argued across borders. Cannons were readied. Brothers turned to enemies. And the throne of Spain, still warm from his body, was handed to strangers who spoke different tongues. The Habsburg name died with Charles, but the curse did not. The palace never returned to silence, not truly. A century later, a chambermaid claimed to see footprints where no one had walked. The physician's journal was found its last page torn out, edges singed, and in the royal nursery. A child once woke screaming, swearing he saw a man with no eyes, sitting in a chair that no longer existed. They burned the chair, but the crying didn't stop. Behind the tapestries, the walls still whisper, beneath the floorboards. Something stirs when the wind comes in wrong, and in portraits long forgotten, Charles still watches mouth agape, eyes hollow, waiting. Not for peace, not for memory, but for someone to understand what it means to be born already condemned. His blood never spilled in war, his hands never signed a death sentence, and yet, the cost of his life was the life of an empire. The room where he died has since been sealed, but the silence inside never left.